So it's a pleasure to be here today, and I hope you all enjoy your lunch. Some of the things that I'm talking about may not be so easy for some of the kinds of things that while you're eating, trauma in children. On the other hand, the more we know about it, the better work we can do. And there's a wonderful DVD that was developed by the Illinois Violence Prevention Authority, and it comes with a little workbook and says stories for children that grown-ups can watch too. And one of the nice things about it is it's done with a little character. So what I'm going to do, since you won't be able to hear the sound, is I'll voice over. But you'll see the cartoons and you'll kind of figure it out. Essentially what it's saying is there's all this going on inside of him that he doesn't understand. And these are illustrating the feelings that are inside him. And he has trouble concentrating, and all of those feelings inside him keep bubbling up all of the time. They bubble up when he tries to go to sleep because he's frightened. And he doesn't know what to do, and he's very quiet, and he has nobody to talk to. So sometimes he does things that he's not supposed to do. He draws on the wall. He knocks down the blocks. He tears up his teddy bear. So his grandma pats him on the head. Maybe he'll be better if his father scolds him. His mother hugs him. And he doesn't know what to do about these feelings. So this neighbor, elderly neighbor, walks along, sees him sitting on the steps, and says she sees all that stuff that's inside him. And nobody's been listening to him. So she encourages him to try to talk about his feelings, and he says it's really hard for him to talk about his feelings. She said, well, just try to talk about one word. And so a word starts to come out. You'll see in a minute. He can say that much. I'm scared. And then the words start pouring out of him. You can see all the words that start pouring out that were inside him, making him feel so upset. And one of the messages of this DVD is that it's very important for children, for us to help children of all ages be able to put words. You're not going to be able to hear that. To help children be able to put words to what their feelings are inside of them. And that's a very important message, that trauma impacts on children, how they feel, things they can or can't talk about, and they really need help linking the feelings inside of them and the meaning. And that's part of our work with them. With younger children, we do it. You can do it with play therapy with younger children, and they can, if they don't have words to express it yet, because a lot of children, very young children don't have words, and also children that are 4 or 5 may be delayed. They can do it through drawing, they can do it through play, but being able to express what's inside. And for older children, there are various types of therapeutic strategies. We're talking about evidence-based therapy. So for the younger children, the evidence-based treatment that we work on a lot is child-parent psychotherapy that was developed by Alicia Lieberman and Patricia Van Horn. So one of the reasons that I always put up a definition of trauma in giving a talk is that there are a number of elements to the definition that are crucial to understand if you're working with children of any age who are traumatized. For younger children, infants and toddlers and younger children, they haven't yet learned how to regulate their emotions. They learn how to regulate their emotions and their behaviors in the context of a relationship. And if they're in a relationship where there's domestic violence, or if they're in a relationship where there's a substance abusing parent, or they're in a relationship where there's no stability, they don't really learn to regulate their emotions. So those are a lot of the kinds of things that you see when children can't control themselves in school, can't control themselves in other situations. They will hit or they'll bite, I mean, beyond the normal limits of normal hitting and biting, and some of it's normal, and we always talk about normative kinds of things. Some of you probably have young children, and you know that 2- and 3-year-olds do some of these behaviors normally, but you learn how to regulate your emotions and behaviors in the context of a relationship, and if you don't have a stable relationship, you don't learn that. And what happens is the powerful and dangerous kinds of stimuli, whether it's domestic violence, whether it's child abuse, whether it's emotional abuse, overwhelm the child. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that and how that happens and why. So what happens with younger children? They lose a sense of trust in adults. So I don't know how many of you work with children in the foster care system. I'm going to talk a little bit about children in the foster care system. But if you think about it, a child who has been abused or neglected to the point that they're taken from their family has a traumatic experience in the first place, because it's a trauma to be taken from their family. They have a traumatic experience in being abused and neglected. Their abusive parent or caregiver is the only one they've ever known. So when they're taken from that person, that's another trauma. Then they have another trauma when they're put with a stranger. If they're lucky enough, they're put with a relative who they're familiar with, but many children are put with strangers. So that's another traumatic experience they have to adjust to. Behavior changes, they can't express how they're feeling, so they're going to show it in their behavior. That dysregulated behavior, either behavior changes, aggression on the one hand. You can also see withdrawal with sexual abuse. You often see the withdrawn behavior. And then regression to earlier behaviors. The child's that toilet trained, who's no longer toilet trained. The child who has some language. We've seen many children at 2 and 3 who had some language, but they're exposed to a terrible trauma and they lose their language, and in the course of therapy, they regain their language. And then post-traumatic stress symptoms that I'll be talking about in detail a little bit later. So these are all of the different ways children are traumatized. There are probably more ways they're traumatized. I might have forgotten. I might not have them all on the list, but this is a pretty comprehensive list. We're talking about child maltreatment. We already talked about that. Exposure to community violence, exposure to domestic violence. And for those of you who see children who are exposed to domestic violence, when the family, the parent or caregiver tells you that they were asleep in the other room and they weren't exposed and they don't know anything about it, it's not the case. They might have been in the other room, but they were exposed and they're frightened by it. We actually saw a little girl last year who was growing up in a family where there's a lot of domestic violence. There wasn't poverty, there wasn't other dysfunction in that family, but the parents fought all the time, and they fought a lot. And finally came to my attention when the mother ended up finally leaving the father after a number of tries when the violence got so bad. And we saw the little 3-year-old. And the first thing that the little 3-year-old did in the playroom was take emergency vehicles, fire trucks, and police cars, and say, let's save the people, you know, and other types of things like that. She was showing in her play, you know, where she was coming from, but she hadn't expressed any of that to the family. And then unusual traumatic events. In Florida, we have hurricanes. Louisiana, we have hurricanes. We know that. All over the world now, we're having earthquakes and tsunamis. What's going on in Japan is just terrible. And those people who've been through hurricanes here certainly have a great deal of empathy related to that, as well as what's going on with the nuclear situation at this point. Wars, terrorist attacks. And then I've added, we work with military children and families. Any of you work with military? Some of you, yeah. Well, the whole issue of deployments and multiple deployments is something that can be traumatizing to children because they're unpredictable. There's not planning. Often military families are located somewhere nowhere near family, and there has to be provisions for children. The home from parent is left without support with deployment, so there are all kinds of things related to deployment. And then I also always put up exposure to media, because people always ask me about exposure to media if I don't have it up there. Television, video games, all of those kinds of things can be traumatizing to children. For children who have a relatively stable life and they're monitored, they have less of an effect.